Hello and welcome to the People, Place and Nature podcast. Today, we for the first time have a returning guest, Ted Green. He's a bit of a maverick and a real mover and shaker in the tree world, someone who calls himself a layman and rarely takes credit for much of the impacts he's made. And he's always one of the first to step forward and help others. So, you may remember from previously when Ted was on, if you've seen that episode, some of the amazing things him and Jill Butler talk about. And his impact stretches way beyond, I think, even he realises. I don't think I've ever attended an event where someone hasn't known Ted, and that includes around the world. He's one of those people that everybody seems to know. And he took me under his wing and really, just taught me a huge amount, not just about trees, but about the landscape around us too. And he really drummed in the importance of, asking questions and not being afraid to be wrong. So when Ted reached out to tell me that he's got a new book coming out called TreeTime, which talks about his life, learnings, coupled with some rants and insights, of course, as well. If you know Ted, I immediately offered for him to come on and talk about his book. So that's precisely what we're doing in this episode. So if you're interested in the environment, trees, soils, landscape, the majesty of the natural world, especially ancient trees, then this is certainly an episode for you. So please enjoy. I hope you've enjoyed the episode so far. Here's a quick message from one of our sponsors. Make sustainability a priority throughout the design process with a suite of tools built specifically for landscape architecture and design. Vectorworks gives you the freedom to follow your imagination wherever it may lead, with remarkably flexible software that integrates BIM for landscape and GIS workflows. Sketch, model, and document in a single tool with the world's most design-centric BIM solution. Discover Vectorworks' landmark and design without limits. Visit vectorworks.net to learn more. Hi, Ted.
How are you doing?
Very well. Thank you so much for joining us again on the podcast. We had a fantastic episode with you and Jill last time, Jill Butler, and it was such an interesting episode, and we talked about so much around how the UK's landscape came to be, historic trees, how a lot of what we think we know perhaps isn't actually quite right, or our understanding is changing. So we're not going to cover that in as much detail as before. This time we're going to be talking about your fantastic new book, which we have here, TreeTime.
Yeah, TreeTime.
Mm-hmm. So super interesting book. So I've been really lucky to have been able to read it sort of a bit ahead of time. So that was really interesting, really exciting to do. It's the first time we've ever got something ahead of time as well, so it made me feel a bit special. So that was good. And we thought it'd be great to come back and talk to you a bit more about the book in a bit more detail. Some of the topics sort of covered in it, and how it sort of came to be, really.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting story because I've actually written another book, and it's called Read the Trees, and it's really just targeted at people to say when you go for a walk, start looking at trees, and and you can possibly see how man has influenced those trees, because so many of the trees, especially in Europe, well, Britain and Europe, are actually influenced by man and have been used by man down the centuries. And it's I call them working trees, because so many trees aren't cut down. They are used, or they were used, far more than they are today, and that is a whole podcast just talking about the fascination with man trees. And then if you think about it, the other thing that influenced trees was animals. So you could say we'd do another podcast called Man, Trees and Animals. Could go for it. So that's how it started. So I actually wrote the book, and it was the beginning of lockdown. And I said to John Parker of the Arboricultural Association, I've just finished a book which we ought to get published, and I said, what am I going to do for the rest of COVID? And he said, write your memoirs. And that did it, because what happened was I spent the whole of lockdown writing this book, which is TreeTime. And the idea of TreeTime is it's a history of my life with trees, because I realised when I started to look at it and write it how significant trees have been in my life. And I don't want to jump too far, but how significant they were, and presumably we'll come to that in when we're talking now. Because I lived in a small village, just outside Windsor Park, and it was at the, if you like, the beginning of the war.
Mm-hmm.
My father was already in Hong Kong, and we got a letter from the ministry to say he's a prisoner of war.
Mm-hmm.
And so we got one letter at the beginning of the war, and one letter from the Red Cross in the middle of the war, and then a letter literally 6 months after victory in Japan to say, well, we think your father's dead.
Mm-hmm.
So my mother and me actually went 4.5 years with not knowing whether he was dead or alive.
Mm-hmm.
But we were not unique.
Mm-hmm.
That is, you've got to stress that there were millions of people in similar circumstances. The whole place was in turmoil. The world was in turmoil. So, and fortunately for me, I lived on the edge of Windsor Park, and I had woodland and farmland and that all the way around us.
Mm-hmm.
So my world, my playground was nature. Hearing birds, because we had no binoculars in those days. Hearing birds, looking at trees, looking at animals, and walking in those forests. And in retrospect, it was probably that atmosphere of those trees and everything around me that kept me from, kept me sane, probably, because of the stress. Because I wasn't going to school because I had all these contagious diseases, which presumably came about from stress. So, my education was nature. And so I've got to, and then because you don't realise that until you're an adult and later in life, you just realise how important trees were to me. In some cases, there's people walking on a seashore, listening to the waves. Me, it was big trees, and standing there thinking, they were not realising what reassurance they were giving me. Looking at a 500-year-old oak, not realising that here we were looking at a tree that had seen so much in its life, and it was still there.
Yeah, some permanence. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's. I always found this quite interesting from sort of my side of things as well, because I remember when I was younger, I talked about this many times on the podcast, where I didn't really know what to do with myself and all that kind of thing. But the one thing I loved was spending time in the forest. My grandparents lived in the middle of the woods, and that was my favourite place to be all of the time, or every chance I could get, really. So I can completely understand where like that kind of relationship and sort of peace and everything you get from that comes from. And I think now, we're starting to recognise it in medicine and all of these sort of fields now as well, aren't we? The value that can have, the reductions in stress, all of these things. So I think it's absolutely right. And as you say, it's often hindsight where you look back and go, oh, hang on a minute. Actually, that probably was more valuable than perhaps you realise. The other thing as well I found interesting that I wish we talked about on the last podcast was that after the podcast, typically you recommended I read Wilding, the book by Isabella Tree about NEP, the big rewilding project in the south of England. And when I was reading that, I found out that actually your engagement with trees was a bit more extreme than perhaps some other people's as well, because of the situation, like you mentioned, with your father and family and things. Actually, you ended up literally living in the forest for quite a period of time as well, didn't you?
Living in the forest and just running wild. Yeah, no, the forest was all round the small village anyway. You just stepped outside your door, and I had a big oak, and it's still there. In the front garden, virtually, yeah. And so the NEP, NEP was a good story, really, because I got invited down there because they'd heard about me. And I went to see this massive great oak and said, I obviously can't give you any advice. I'm just a layman, but I know people in the Arboricultural Association that can give you advice. And then in talking like that, we talked about the fact that the agriculture was trashing all his trees, and he didn't know. He was a farmer, or was, and that's where it all started, because Jill actually got Franz Vera over to talk to him, and Franz Vera, and then again Jill got them to go to Oostvaardersplassen, as I say, and saw that, and then they saw the rewilding on the Rhine with Willy Overmars, and there, of course, being in Germany and Holland, the purpose footpath was brilliant, and on that footpath with us were joggers and walkers, cyclists, and then we were actually standing in a group of, I call them Galloways, but belted Galloways, black and white cattle with no horns. And there was the bull, there was the lead cow, she was there with a heifer, and she was there with a calf. And we're all standing amongst these cows, which were, free range. And then a lady came along with a little pushchair, with a baby in the pushchair and a little dog. And I looked at Charlie, and he looked at the woman and the pushchair and the dog. He looked at the bull, and I knew he was going home to start the rewilding project, which, with him and his wife now, has gone round the world. And that all started with him looking at that lovely, docile, big bull. And also, on top of that, of course, the rewilding that they'd done of the Rhine is now attributed to saving at least 2 towns and villages when they had the Great Flood a year ago, because it held the water back. And there wasn't such. Otherwise, it would have floundered. Other years, it would these villages and that would have been flooded. So all in all, the whole thing is wonderful.
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting about you and what makes the book so interesting is you've had so many sort of experiences of like helping take people on that journey and understand sort of the systems and the value and intrinsic value that some of these things have, that at the time perhaps was considered sort of more intrinsic, whereas now sort of scientific evidence is sort of coming to back it up. And you mentioned a moment ago, and then with the title of the book as well, Tales of a Layman, you talk a lot about being a layman. And I think, again, I remember when we first met, you sort of, I remember you grabbed me and you said, come on, I'll introduce you everyone, you're one of my boys. And I was sort of going, who is this? And when we first met. But you sort of took me around and showed me and talked to me a lot about how, you don't need to be an expert to have a big impact. And that's something, again, that comes out a lot through the book, that actually, not having the specialism as such, but having that like broad, I suppose, lateral thinking is kind of the way people are describing it now, of sort of seeing how things fit together, thinking in a different way, has led you to sort of have so many different interactions and bring so many different people together to bring these solutions that I think often it's quite hard to sort of demonstrate. But with a book like this and all the things you've done, you sort of go, oh, actually, I can see how you've ended up in all these different places and brought all these different people together.
Well, I think if you get a label, then that's your standard and you live by it. So if you call yourself an ecologist or you're a scientist with a degree, I think you're obviously very nervous to actually say, I don't know, or even ask questions. I mean, the top scientists we've got in the UK is a dynamic woman in fungi called Lynn Boddy. She's a professor, and invariably she'll turn around to you if you ask her a question and she'll say, I don't know. And people are knocked back to imagine that a professor in fungi, is because she's a professor, doesn't know. But that is the measure of a real scientist.
Yeah.
They know, and they're on the quest for knowledge all the time, and invariably a lot will come from ordinary people. And never stop asking questions, because that always leads from one to the other.
That's it.
And I think somewhere in your notes you talk about getting it wrong. Well, if you think about it, if you haven't got a reputation, there's nothing wrong with being wrong, but if you are wrong, you learn something. And people don't realise that. Getting things wrong is great because you learn.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I completely agree. I think it's it also comes back to sort of the saying where, you know, the more you know, the less you understand as well. But as you say, people often don't sort of show that's the case. You know, I've met a lot of experts that sort of, they know their bit, but they don't necessarily get some of the bigger bit, or they're not willing to sort of step outside of their field, which then makes it very difficult to sort of make the connections we need to come up with longer term solutions or more integrated approaches, you know.
Call yourself an expert and you've ring-fenced yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And getting stuff wrong is vital, you know, because as you say, if you're not wrong or you don't make a mistake and you don't get told off, I've had a lot of tellings off over my life, and I found that after them I've always ended up sort of reapproaching how I do that thing quite differently. So it's the only way you really grow as a person, I think.
Yes.
But so I thought also one other thing I wanted to sort of cover as well is a bit about how the UK's obligation to nature. So we talked a bit about this previously, about the value of ancient trees and things, of course, but I think you sum it up really well in this book about how the UK's biggest obligation to nature is its ancient trees and their sort of protection. And also around, it's also our biggest gift from the past as well. And how we're so different from the rest of Europe, for instance, in terms of the quantity and the quality of our ancient trees.
Well, I think it starts with taking trees for granted, and obviously you shouldn't take them for granted, and it was started with Oliver Rackham, who said you can drive from or you can go from Britain to Athens or somewhere like that before you start seeing old trees again. And so I came up with this. We had the single biggest we had the largest number of ancient trees. That got watered down to Europe and all the rest of it, whereas we were trying to pull back and say we have the largest number of ancient trees north of the Pyrenees or north of the Mediterranean. But it you know how things get distorted, but whatever happens, we still have got the single biggest obligation in Northern Europe to ancient trees such as oaks and sweet chestnut and beech. And presumably the reasons, one of the reasons for that is that, first of all, we are a very small country that got coal. And when we got coal, and it was very easy to move it from the mines to people, wood fuel. So we got wood fuel. Equally, we had the big estates, which were hunting estates, which kept the old trees, and we hadn't had a war for, I think, is it 400 years, 200 years? So what it meant was that the old trees never got used for wood fuel. And of course, when we had a war, we went to Europe. And one thing about old trees is they're usually easy to cut down and use for wood fuel. And moving armies and refugees marching about during a war would obviously find them very easy to use. So we had that we've been in that unique situation outside Sweden. Sweden still has some big old trees like we do, but most of the countries don't. And what most of the countries in Europe, if they've got an old tree, it's revered and it's on all the maps. And the best example, of course, is the Michelin guide. Michelin maps. And look on the French Michelin maps and you'll find all their oak trees. You know, and that's incredible. So people can go and actually see them. Here, we just take them for granted.
Yeah, that's the trouble, isn't it? Too much of a good thing almost. I think it's interesting as well with regards to how you sort of frame it in the book, because you talk as well about the value of these ancient trees again, as we've talked about, sort of how they have an intrinsic value, but also this great heritage value and everything else. But also you put it really nicely where you say that these ancient trees are carrying species through time. They're like arcs, you describe them as, and how they're helping take species through time. And I thought that's a really quite poetic way to sort of explain how they work, and they function, and the value that they actually have. It's not just a tree; it's actually an arc that's carrying all of these things, and that's why they're so vital for nature conservation, because there's many things that you can only find there.
Yeah. Well, since I've seen you, I think probably we've moved quite a long way on that, because first of all, one of the biggest oak trees in Wales, the Ponfaddock oak, blew over, and an arborist, Murray Simpson, collected cuttings from it and gave some to Kew, some to Windsor Horticultural Department, and the other to a colleague of ours called Pete Wells, and they were grafted onto young saplings, and they had great success in Windsor and Pete Wells. So now we have some quite big grafted Ponfaddock oak. So we've got the pure tree on a cutting, and we're being able to take cuttings from the cutting, because it's nearly 3 meters high, and graft them back onto a sapling, which is pure Ponfaddock oak. So you've got a Ponfaddock oak sapling being grafted back onto itself. Now, so that is what we call gene banks, saving gene banks. And Prof. Mick Crawley, an oak expert, he says the genes conserved in that sapling are absolutely priceless for science, because they are never replicated in any other any other oak tree. So they're unique. So this massive, great Ponfaddock oak is genetically saved. Now we've gone on to now do some of the trees at Windsor, one in Belgium. We're hoping the one in Sweden may have worked. So this is taking off. And also, we've started an arboretum now at Windsor. And the Prince actually planted some of these cuttings. So he's well involved in it. So getting a gene bank arboretum, which will be a first for the world.
Yeah, no, it's great. And I think, again, it's about making sure that we're preserving that heritage as effectively as we can.
Yes.
But also it's around, you mentioned right at the start about sort of the management of the trees as well. And I think I meant to touch on this earlier, but just to bring it back, because I think it's related, that a lot of these trees have ended up in sort of the situations they are and the size they are because of the way that they've been working trees or used by people. So bringing the trees back genetically, but also I guess are you going to be looking to bring back sort of some of those practices as well to ensure their continued vitality as part of the management?
Probably, because I only ever really talk about oak, but probably it would be that, like Windsor's trying to do, is provide space. We don't really think in forest. I mean, I could go on for hours about sweeping statements about forest, but yeah, let's just stick with all the gene banks that we're planting are open grown, because you can say that the two most important trees to be grown in the open, believe it or not, is oak, and the most light demanding tree of all in the whole of Europe is Scots pine. Scots pine, yes, it can grow as a telephone pole and all the rest of it, but it loves being on its own in the open, just like oak. So the more we can restore that open grown landscape, and of course we've seen that disappear. It really started, well, it was a gradual process of getting rid of the treescapes, open-grown treescapes of Europe, mainly through agriculture, probably. But then we got Dutch elm disease. So one of the major species that was open-grown in the landscape throughout Europe and North America, for that matter, was elm. So that went, and now we've had Cholera, which has gone through, and there's a lot of fuss about it, but it's gone through, and what's left is probably will remain. And then we've had the hurricanes and various diseases coming across. So it's the open-grown treescape. It's the trees of the hills and the downs and well, anywhere. I mean, take black poplar that used to line the riverbanks. Beautiful, absolutely majestic, pure black poplar is something to see. And we've lost so many of them. So we're trying to capture that before it's too late, because we're talking about my time in my childhood when these trees, again, were taken for granted. And, you know, so it's restoring the treescape, really.
Yeah.
And where possible, with genetic stock.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense because, again, as you say, you know, the ecosystem is becoming more and more fragmented as well. There's such a big risk of those genetics being lost. So making sure we're maintaining that as effectively as possible is really key.
Yeah.
And then I think on the treescape bit then, so previously when you guys were on, we talked a lot about sort of how the UK landscape used to be. Principally, you talk a lot like it would have been sort of oak pasture is what you call it, or silver pasture, perhaps one way to look at it as well. But I think the easiest way for many people to understand it is more savanna-esque, isn't it? A bit more like savanna with sort of copses and individual trees, with many more open areas with odd bits of scrub sort of here and there and grassland. That is what we think now is probably more likely to have been the majority of like the UK landscape.
Well, we know it was because, I mean, woodlands don't support animals, so they wouldn't have had cows,
large herbivores
cows and
things,
horses and
as many deer
and deer,
or herds of deer.
Yeah. Well, deer. The big problem I think for deer is the fallow deer in the south, and of course the red deer on the hill. Which you don't find in Europe. So, and I think we discussed this, but. So where we see the problem for our woodlands being deer, if you go to the similar to Europe, in a similar situation, the forester looks at it and just says, no, that's shade, because they don't have deer. They've never had deer. But not in the numbers that they are now, of course.
Well, that's what I was going to say. So they have, to be clear, they have got deer, but they're much more dispersed, and also they have more of that.
Few.
They call it, few of them. They're less. It's less densely populated as here, whereas the UK's got a really high density of deer now. I was reading somewhere. I think it's 3 times higher than it perhaps should be in the natural environment now, which is why we've got a lot of big problems. But also, you have like the landscape of fear is the other way that it's sort of referred to by sort of some sort of conservationists and like hunters, whereby basically, and what that means is that animals don't stay put. What you easily think of like, oh, the deer live in that wood. That would happen in the UK because that's the place they can go for shelter. Whereas in somewhere across Europe, they're more likely to move much more frequently around the landscape, opposed to staying in sort of one place as often. And that's because of the landscape of fear, because of predators and all of these other things, which we don't necessarily have here. So that causes a lot more concentrated sort of browsing and things too, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think when you talk about the deer problem in Britain, you've got to add the deer problem and shade. Because we've still got the European problem of shade, plus we've got herds of fallow deer and that marching about, and of course they're sustained mainly by agriculture. I mean, I think that is the two big issues, and Yeah.
So on the problem of shade, then. So what do you mean specifically by that? So
Well, shade.
so as you said, sorry, just to clarify. So
Sure.
as you said, oak trees and Scots pine and some of our other species are really light loving. So that is indicative that actually they're not woodland trees as such, which is where this kind of understanding has come from, isn't it? That actually these type of species you wouldn't have lots of woodland because these species just wouldn't survive in woodland, basically.
Under any circumstances, it's very. I mean, you do get, of course, these trees grow in woodland, but it's usually under a man-made situation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's the way you've got to look at it. And of course, I suppose one of the ways it happens is that animals got diseases.
Mm.
So, I mean, you should read the books of on the drovers on how they moved to animals around Britain to market and this sort of thing, and how occasionally all the animals died. So what it meant was that you lost all the grazing animals or browsing animals, which were having an effect on the treescape, and then they died out. So you get a pulse of where, if there was any regeneration, it got away.
Yeah.
And so that would get up. But if it was light demanding trees and shade tolerant trees, then eventually what happens is the shade tolerant trees win. And if you read Franz Vera's book, there's lots of examples of in North America, in Europe, wherever you go, where eventually the woods gradually turn to shade tolerance. And in Europe, the two thugs, if you like, are beech and hornbeam. And I don't know of an example where beech and hornbeam are competing themselves for it, but there's classic examples of that all over the world. And that's not deer.
Yeah.
That's shade.
Yeah, that's like the natural progression of forest, basically, isn't it? Yeah. But yeah, so it's kind of like that in a natural system, it wouldn't get to that state typically.
Yeah.
Because of grazing animals, yeah. So a bit on sort of the other side of ancient trees then, around sort of the human interaction with them, about how we used to sort of manage the trees and look after them as well, and how those traditional sort of management techniques and systems have helped make them what they are. So one of the main ones that we talk about is pollarding.
Yes.
Which is where essentially it's like an elevated coppice, which is where essentially you're cutting the tree's branches off at a set height above the ground.
Yeah, well, I suppose I wanted to draw up that word pollarding, and so many years ago I started saying, well, these were trees that were working for a living. So I started calling them working trees to try and show people, just like copses, that they actually, you cut them on a rotation, or at least you cut them in such a way that you got the odd limb when you needed it.
Yeah.
The bigger limbs I'm thinking of, and the ones that went especially for shipbuilding and house building, in fact, from that point of view. And it was something which I got quite interested in the other day when I realised that I think even in my lifetime, scaffolding was wood. It wasn't metal, it wasn't steel scaffold, it was wood. And the whole of China is built on bamboo scaffolding. So they're still using it to build these huge skyscrapers. And presumably most of the big buildings in Britain, the high buildings, must have had a phenomenal amount of timber poles to do that. But you don't see any mention of it. It's something that's almost slipped off the Richter in my lifetime. Amazing. But pollarding to me is has kept a lot of the trees that I can go out and read trees and say, this tree was cut once or twice, and this tree was providing some branches, I call them branches or limbs, for man to use for some reason. and cut on a rotation.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think that's one of the things we've seen change a lot. Like I was in a talk recently about urban trees, and we were talking about how that a lot of the big street trees, even in London or something like that, are now starting to have impacts on housing, or there's concerns about it having impacts on housing. And one of the reasons why we think now they're starting to have an impact on housing, not before, is because now we no longer do those maintenance techniques. Because back in the day, since the Victorian times, when a lot of them were established, they did pollard them just as part of the standard management. Whereas now we've lost a lot of those traditional techniques, which gave like the longevity to the tree, but also limited its sort of impact on the built environment as well.
Yes, I like it. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Oh, well, I'm glad you agree. I thought you were going to say something completely contrary. Go, no, that never happened. But no, I'm glad. Glad you agree.
But when it comes down to it, I think trees have had so many uses. So many uses. I mean, they were planted in different places. I mean, one of the things that we came across was going to Romania, which still has a lot of what we call ancient oak wood pasture, in the way that it's been managed for thousands of years. And there we saw some big open-grown beech trees, not your forest beech tree, but big open-grown trees. And the shepherds were waking up the seed. And it's in the husks and all the rest of it. So they were sieving out the seed. And the guy we were with said that's going to feed the animals in the winter. But we know in history that beech seed was used for lamp oil. It was all used for cooking oil,
bread,
and also just to eat. It's an invaluable nutritional thing for man and, of course, his animals. So I said, that's a fruit tree. And the guy I was with, a Romanian, just says, well, of course it is. Basically all the trees, we didn't only use them to cut the branches off, but
indeed.
They were all used for some use.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I found it quite, when I started looking into it in a bit more detail, when I was doing forestry, to find out what else you can do with the trees, what other value they have. It's really unbelievable just how much stuff you used to use them for. Like, like the oak tree, for instance. Even now, you still typically think of it as just being used for timber or some form of wood. But actually, people used to make bread from the acorns, which you would never think people would do, because you're always told sort of, they're poisonous, don't eat them. But actually, people knew how to process it back then. The same with beech. They used to make bread from beech as well, didn't they? I believe.
Yeah.
So and like hawthorn, the red berries from hawthorn, the haws, like they used for jam. Used to be used very traditionally for jam making.
Yes.
And the same with rowan. In Russia, actually, I was in Russia a couple of months ago, and my nephew kept eating all these bright red berries, and I said, "What the hell are you doing? What are you eating all these berries for?" And he was like, "Well, I know I can eat them." And I was like, "How do you know?" And he said, "Well, I just know I can eat them off that tree." And I was like, "Oh, it's a rowan, the rowan berries." And he was like, "Yeah." And I tried them, and they're bloody horrible. But all the kids in Russia just walking around picking all these berries to eat them because it's what they've always done, And I just thought, crikey, again, you go into the other countries and see how the relationship is. And even now, like lime trees, we have Telia tea at home very often. And my father-in-law in Belarus, he goes and picks all the bracts off the lime trees, boils them, and makes tea from them.
Yes.
And it's a very nice, sweet tea. Very, very simple. But again, like you would never, well, you probably would, but for me, even having done forestry, it's something we never really heard about. I mean, I remember some of our lecturers would pick the fresh leaves from beech as well and sort of eat them because they taste like apple.
Yeah.
Apple skin tastes exactly like apple skin, the young baby
And why
ones.
not?
And why not? Yeah, you're there, right? So, I think we forget that there's that, like, actually how much we could use the trees for. So much of that is forgotten.
It's lost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And it's been losing it as we speak.
Well, indeed.
As you know, I'm busy trying to raise tree hay. Now, tree hay is where you cut the branches in the summer and you dry them and feed them to the animals in the winter.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you're down in the Mediterranean, where you cut them and feed them to the animals in the summer, because the rest of it's burned off. So you've got summer hay, but in the northern hemisphere, you've got winter hay. And winter hay off trees predates haymaking. It was a long time before haymaking, because you could cut it. You didn't have a tool to cut.
Yeah, you could cut it with a stone axe or whatever.
Cut hay. Yeah. So and we've made little films of it and all the rest of it, showing how the animals go actually mad for it, because the idea that animals eat grass is a very modern thing. Most animals had a whole range of foods. I mean, like, for example, horses. You say to somebody with a horse, do you get the vet to file its teeth? Because its teeth are growing all the time. And they look at you and say, yes, of course. But I just said, but you don't see them out in the Serengeti filing the teeth of the zebra, because they get worn down. The animals are allowed to eat the food of choice, and they keep their teeth worn down. But now we live in this modern world where, well, we're losing it all the time.
Yeah.
And being driven, I tell you now, by the veterinary industry, definitely the veterinary industry.
So on the pharmaceutical side then, I remember last time we talked a lot about the value of tree hay, but also in terms of the nutrients and things and the range of the importance for animals' diet, but also that we talked a bit about its value in terms of sort of pharmaceuticals, and actually most species can sort of almost self-medicate by selectively picking what they want to eat from it as well.
Yeah. I think we've still got a lot to learn from animals. Animals still have instinct, and we've lost it. You know, I mean, I think what we did was, in the old days, you would see an animal that didn't look very well, and you'd watch it go off and eat a bush. So you probably thought, right, if the animal's being cured from eating that bush or that tree, I'm going to try it. And that's how we got aspirin.
Yeah, from willow.
I mean, that is the key one there. But, now they're into synthetic drugs and things like that. Then it's easier for them. But then we're losing that, whatever it is, that knowledge and that history of how we self-medicated on different things,
Yeah, I think we still have it to a degree, but I think it's very, very sort of vegetable or fruit specific, isn't it? Like it's no different to having a lemon or some ginger if you've got a sore throat, is it? But it's just we've only know those sort of really commercialized options. The rest are sort of lost to time almost.
And what did we have before we had lemon and ginger?
Onion.
And that's the other way to look at it. What did we use?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because my family, we never really, we were sort of not farmers, but they had sort of small holdings. My family grew a lot of their own vegetables, and we always used to. I wouldn't even say specifically. It's almost just like subconsciously in a way. If you were feeling ill, you'd have a really strong onion soup or something like that with loads of garlic and onion, wouldn't you, to sort of get it through your system to heat you up. And there's a lot of sort of those sort of things. But again, like talking about Russia or Belarus, if you're sick, they immediately bust out all the herbs straight away. Loads of different herbs, or you need to sit down and eat this thing. Here, have some of this flour or whatever. And I don't mean flour as in wheat flour. I mean like this literal flour. Eat this. It's very, very different to sort of how it is here. Whereas here you go, I'm not going to bother with that. It can be those paracetamol or whatever. I know your sort of strapline is Ted Green, fungi first, but maybe it should be Ted Green, fungi and food first.
Yes, yeah. But I've got an interesting one which came up quite recently, 2 years ago or something. But when you go to NEP, they have hundreds and hundreds of ragwort.
Yeah.
Quite high, metre, metre and a half high, all in flower, and everybody says, "Oh, oh," and yet of course, the free range Exmoor ponies are amongst it, all this ragwort, and nothing happens. But then I began to realise that a lot of these clumps are damaged. And I wondered about it. What's caused the damage? And then I actually saw an old cow go up to one of these clumps of ragwort and bash it around like this. So she was getting the leaves and the flowers touching her face. And then I realised what it was. Flies. And leaves to flies are poisonous. It's a red kite. So here was a cow from instinct knowing that if she smashed a ragwort around her face, it stopped the flies. Now that is instinct.
Yeah, really interesting.
And we've lost that.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Isn't it elder as well as the other one that sort of helps that because it stinks so much?
Yeah.
I remember when we did forestry, we didn't used to go around rubbing it on ourselves, but I remember sometimes we sort of joke about, oh, if it got really bad, let's go and find some elder and brush it all over ourselves to keep the flies away because it stinks so much.
Yeah.
Is it cheese plant? Like a lot of people call it as well. Interesting. And then I just wanted to touch a little bit on the sort of tree hay side as well, because I was thinking, are you starting to see much of a resurgence in that? Because we've got so much going on now in sort of regenerative agriculture and silver pasture and also biodiversity net gain and things. I mean, biodiversity net gain could help fund the introduction of it, but I don't think people will know about the management too much. But to me, it seems like a really logical point in time where we're introducing loads more trees, or should be introducing loads more trees, more open grown trees into the landscape as part of those sort of systems to make farming more resilient and deal with all the other issues we've got. And it makes sense if we're going to be planting a lot of them out to get more product from them. Now, I know tree hay in some ways it's more intensive to harvest than it would be, say, just running up and down with a flail or something to cut the hay. But it's got so much more value, and it means you can get another crop from your land as well. So I was just wondering, have you found much of an increase in people looking at it? Or not really?
That I know of. We had this hiccup where I think it was getting quite interesting for people, but I've not heard. I mean, I haven't heard.
Yeah, because I've got a couple of potential projects where a lot of equestrian land, and they're sort of going, well, I want to do something for nature. And I said, well, plant trees along all those bloody fences, because then you've got cover for all the horses, and if you top them all, you're going to have all the hay as well from it, and then you've got something coming back. So I was thinking, like, surely something like, I'm just using my ignorance here because it's not my area, but in essentially, like, there should be a lot of opportunities like that to try and get more trees back into the landscape.
Well, having said what I've just said, NEP actually planted just under a kilometre of what we call fodder hedge. So it's all tree species which don't have thorns.
Right, okay.
Now that's, people say, oh, well, that's not wildlife and all that sort of stuff, but they're all trees which can be cut for tree hay. Because the problem, of course, for hawthorn, blackthorn, that sort of thing, it must be very difficult for an animal if it was mixed in with tree hay. So we did it, and I think they cut it for the first time this year.
Oh, right.
To feed to animals. So I'm down there in 2 weeks' time. So I'm going to find out more about what happened. So it's the first that we know of where people have grown a hedge purposely to cut to feed animals.
Because I was just thinking in terms of like corridor planting.
Yeah.
You know, you could very easily just run along it with a guy in a bucket of a telehandler or something. Trim the top off while it's young, pack it up on the bottom, and you've got another great crop.
Yeah, well, my idea was that they use the old balers
Yeah.
and convert it so that it went down and cut the hedge and baled it,
Yeah,
and
that'd
then
be
the
a much
top,
easier
and then
way.
cut the sides.
Yeah.
We'll see. But
Yeah, it'd be interesting to
he's
find
done
out.
it. He's done it. So that's one thing you can think about.
Hmm.
And if you're down that way, go and see it.
Yeah, I'll ask. I've been that way a few times, but I haven't managed to. Actually, I went to Nep recently, but I didn't have much of a chance to look around. Typically, I just had to pop in and see someone. But on that management side, then, while we're still there, you talk a lot about other ways to sort of manage trees and how perhaps we should manage them slightly differently. So this is more for sort of arbs and things, but things around like coronet cuts. Is it coronet cut? It's called,
Yeah.
and then also about keeping higher stumps. So the other thing that I find interesting is a lot of projects. I'm a landscape architect, so I do a lot of landscape projects typically. But we also do a lot of advice in terms of how are we going to keep the tree asset that is there and manage it. And if there are trees that have got to be removed, how do we do it in a way that we can keep as much sort of benefit as possible? So we always say leave the tree, only remove what is unsafe, the rest of it leave. If it's going to fall away from something, fine, make it safer so it can stay there and sort of die down, as you say. But also there's other things as well, like cutting stumps really high and these coronet cuts too. I don't know if you want to touch a little bit on about why some of those are important.
Okay, well, cutting the high stump is something I try and talk to foresters about, because I say that they cut all the harvesting at the ground level, and they've taken away what could be a home for certainly a bird, which works for 365 days a year, purely for them, searching for insects, insect eggs, larvae, whatever. 365 days, it's looking for controlling the damaging insects to that crop. But they don't provide a home. Foresters don't do a home. Whereas if we went to Windsor, and we've done it now, where they've gone through in a harvesting and left stumps. And then the man that's cutting the stumps just makes a cavity in the stump, and they get occupied basically every day, every time. Incredible. So it's trying to get them to work with nature, use nature. Nature will help them if you help nature. And the idea of ripping branches off, that's getting too heavy, but if you leave stub ends, stub ends are natural. If you'd have gone out after the 1987 hurricane and saw the trees that were standing, nearly all of them lost branches. And when they lost a branch and it broke off, it was almost certainly over a metre away from the trunk. But somehow along the line, we have got that we cut now to the trunk.
Yeah,
because it looks nice.
Yeah.
But it's not. It's difficult to say. Yes, you do get some that happen like that, but the bulk of them will be over a metre out. So why are we doing it? It's in their heads.
Yeah.
It's a man-made construct. And so more and more we're trying to get people to see the visual effect of leaving stub ends.
Yeah.
And in some cases, the coronet cut.
So what is a coronet cut?
A coronet cut is where you cut, instead of cutting it straight off.
Yeah.
So you get a flush. It's called a flush. Bare end to the branch. You cut it with a saw in such a way, so you cut the branch off. Yeah. You're left with a flat end, clean cut. Yeah. And then you just get a saw and cut V's and jagged and make it look natural. And people see it as natural. Because a flush cut, as they call it, it doesn't look natural. It looks ugly. And it's getting people to see that. And because surely we should be going through that tidy vogue of what we expect a tree to look like, we should look at the tree and let the tree tell us what it wants to look like.
Yeah, I think it's what I liked about that as well. In the book, you talk about the sort of value it adds to nature as well. It's not just about looking natural, but it's that can create a really useful habitat for bats or insects or whatever else it may be as well that can sort of climb into those holes. So it's also about, as you said before, with the high stumps, it's about making a home for nature, sort of wherever you can, so to speak, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting as well. I think I'm trying to think what else the other thing I wanted to ask you was. Because it was about, oh yeah, that was it. So on the regards to, with regards to sort of forestry, one thing I found quite interesting in the book is you talk about the importance of leaving brash piles. So typically when a forester or someone else comes and does coppicing or any sort of tree work, you very often have a big fire and burn all the bits that are left. But obviously leaving it, you're leaving more for nature, but it's more scruffy looking. And I found an interesting sort of like, parallel in the book in a way where at one point you talk about the value for them being there in terms of extra habitat and places to hide for hedgehogs, all of those kind of things. But then also later on, I can't remember where it is now, but in somewhere there's a bit you talk about that actually we're seeing some fungi much less frequently that we think are associated with fires.
Yeah.
But because now typically what also happens is when you do have a fire, you sort of cool the embers down, you sort of spread them out opposed to leaving it in one place or whatever. So that's affecting how fungi are coming into the woodland as well. And I thought it was quite an interesting sort of like juxtaposition of things. But again, it just goes back to show that there's not always one set way to sort of do everything, if you know what I mean. And I was just wondering what your thoughts on that were.
Well, just mentioning the word fire to me is bad news. We should have moved on. There's no place for fires, and because of recycling the minerals and nutrients which are in the timber or the twigs or whatever you're not using, they should just be left there. Spread them out, throw them around, or whatever. I'm thinking about coppicing now, or make a brush pile. I mean, but the idea of burning it, to me, is wrong. And what I found was when people have a fire, you have a cone of influence under that fire, which cooks the soil underneath. So any roots from any of the plants that are underneath where that bonfire is get burned. And that can introduce all sorts of funny things, including diseases. And this came about very noticeable when we were talking about a fungus called the bonfire fungus. And it was always found where there was a bonfire. And then around the bonfire, all the nearest trees would be affected because they had burnt roots. But the fungus got the blame for it. And that went on for years. So it's called a bonfire fungus. But then, with the coming of the chainsaw especially, people stopped having bonfires. So the thing just has virtually disappeared. Except we were on Mount Etna, where you've got the lava flows, which are fires. And on the edge of the lava flow, where you've got scorched trees, you see the bonfire fungus. So its natural home is a lava flow, the edge of a lava flow. The idea of burning minerals and nutrients which your plants of the future could use is stupid. I mean, it's one brain cell.
Yeah.
And of course, I have great debates with coppicers, and I just said you're just pyromaniacs. And then a lot of the botanists, they say, oh, if you leave the brush, it's difficult for the next flower-rich generation to come up. But I said, well, look at your bonfire. What's growing where your bonfire was? It's not your primroses and your bluebells and that sort of thing. No way. It's a sterile soil underneath.
Mm.
But then, that's the one brain cell, Rob.
That's
Mom.
true. Well, yeah, I used to do a lot of coppicing, and the fire's all the best bit.
Well, there you go.
That's the trouble, though, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's the trouble.
yeah, there you go, yeah.
No, but it's a really good point. It's a really good point, and I think it's where we've got to think about sort of how that management is more effectively sort of introduced and monitored, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the word is as near natural as possible.
Yeah.
You can get in any maintenance. What would happen if it was nature?
Yeah. I think the other thing as well to point out with the fires is that they're a lot more intense than you would otherwise get in nature and centralized, aren't they? So you may have a big fire in nature, but it wouldn't be all focused on one spot as hot typically as one of those. Okay, so that brings me on to some questions I sort of have for you generally, having read the book, and that I've asked some other people about as well. So because there's certain themes that come up a lot through the book. So one of the things you talk about a lot is, which I found really great, because I've never really seen that in any book ever before, is how you talk about this would make a great study, or we don't know anything about that, someone should look into it. And you talk about that just consistently throughout the book, going, oh, we don't know how this works, or that's really cool, we're really interested to find that out. So I thought I'd ask you, if there was one study, or a couple of studies if you can't pick just one, what key areas do you think we should do more research into?
Well, certainly the soil.
Mm-hmm.
Any study that takes in the soil, I think, is got to be paramount. But my bet now is oak mildews.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of money being spent on oak dieback, save the oak trees, all this sort of thing. Lots of research, but they're not looking at what's been a problem in most of my life, which is oak mildew, putting the trees under stress. So I learned this from a friend of mine, and it comes from medicine, man medicine, and that is the web of causation. So when we're looking at oak mildews, we're not looking at the cause. If they looked at the cause, saying, why are the trees so susceptible, and what is mildew doing to these trees, then I think that would go a long, long way to save the oak. And there's a lot going on about saving the oak at the moment, but they're not looking at oak mildew. And I think that they miss a point.
Okay, that's an interesting
And of course,
choice.
the other one is we've got to find a way to control man, the population. And until we're brave enough to do that, then you've just come from a conference. Did you ever hear the word overpopulated? Did you hear population?
Well, I'm hearing it both ways, because there's a lot of environmental people that say overpopulation, but I also know a lot of people that are worried about underpopulation, because now we're having there's huge demographic issues across most of the developed world. So, well, it is. We've reached the peak of the population, and now they're rapidly going into decline.
Yeah, but they haven't seen it. They haven't,
Not the answer you wanted. But
the underpopulation people are the people that don't understand the implications of even one human being.
Well,
because everything you do is an effect on the planet. Everything, even me shouting.
Yeah, no, of course. Well, we all have an impact living, don't we?
If we take that onto consideration, then man's so adaptable. They're seeing the overpopulation as, the decreasing population as maintaining the situation as it is today. But it's changing as we speak. Man is incredibly good at adaptation. That is why we've got where we are. Yeah. And it's so much. And of course, well, I don't know. I could go on for hours.
Well, no, I think it's an interesting one, because it depends how you look at it as well, because I've seen a lot of, obviously, economically, it's not good, because there's less people making and spending money. So that's one of the big aspects of why a lot of people are concerned. But then there's a lot of concern about maintaining pensions and all this kind of thing as well. But as you say, less people, less resources. So if the planet's going to start recovering, the less people we have, the less demand there's going to be. So naturally, consumption in theory should come down anyway.
Yeah, and the one thing is adaptation.
Yeah.
Man is so ingenious that no problem from that point of view is overcome. It is not overcomable. But it's why we try to retain our attitude.
Yeah.
I mean, it's we just see it all the time. Anyway, so
no, it's a very interesting point, but also because it's leading to it's not just a declining population; it's a moving population. So again, I've just been in Russia, and my family in Russia, they talk a lot about depopulation because Russia's massive, but everybody lives in a few of the big cities, and that's dramatically accelerating. And obviously, a lot of people are leaving now because of the situation as well, or being lost in the conflict. So they're seeing they've got one of the worst demographics in the world. And they've also got a population that's largely moving out of the country, a young population. So they're now having very big areas where there's just no people, and you're seeing the same in Italy and all these places too. But it builds a better case for nature recovery and restoration of these regions as well. So there's going to be a lot of that kind of stuff coming up, and you see it in cities like Detroit. So much of Detroit is abandoned or derelict or whatever, and there's a lot of people looking at that, going, well, how do we actually get rid of all that crap that's left from when people lived there, the ruins and the derelict city, and how do we actually use that as a method to protect the city of the future, build it better for the people that are there, that kind of thing. So there's also going to be a lot about land use change and coming about as the population continues to more rapidly expand and move. So it's quite an interesting area. But we didn't come to talk about that. So so let's go on to the next bit. So although we've touched on this slightly, one of the other things that came up that I noticed you sort of mentioned was, I think you say something in the book along the lines of, well, there's a lot of things that really annoy me, but we'll talk about something else instead. So I thought I'd give you the opportunity to talk about some of the things that annoy you. If there's anything, again, sort of specific that you think, actually, it's just ridiculous we're doing this. So fire's been a really good one. Is there anything else that is sort of frustrating you that you think could be looked at?
This book, any profit made from this book is going to go to education. Mm-hmm. I think it's fundamental that it's no good beating on the door unless you're trying to help these people or educate them, or at least inform them. It's difficult to use the word education, but it's informing people and giving them the facts, and then let them decide that they can see the way forward. Mm-hmm. It's like you and me debating the demographics of human beings. So I've put all this money, hopefully it's a lot of money, back into education. Mm-hmm. And I think if we can start there, then the rest of it builds. Because then people like yourself that are aware of the facts are asked to come in and communicate. At the moment, we're pushing on the door, trying to communicate, and the door's not open. I mean, my best example, of course, is BBC. I've had at least two goes when I've got to the director of Radio 4. And in both cases, I said, you have thought for the day, interesting. People can listen to it or not listen to it, but some of them are interesting, others are not. It's not necessarily religious. But I said, where is your environmental thought for the day? Why are we not having a program every day, which is a little snippet of something that we're doing? I mean, how often this week have you seen a huge glacier drop into the sea? No. Did you know that the biggest island or iceberg has just moved? It's been stuck for 100 years or something or other, a huge iceberg, and it was stuck, and now it's moving. and it's probably gone far larger than the Isle of Wight. So all these little factors. I mean, how many people realise that leaving an idling diesel car is 8 times more polluting?
Mm-hmm.
So you go back down to this school in a minute, just outside. They'll be picking up their kids. All the engines will be running, and the particulates are 8 times higher because the engines are running. So all these little things, leaving a tap running while you wash your teeth, all this little drip, drip, drip will help people. And so I see the environment as the biggest thing that we should be talking about. I don't necessarily like the word educate. We've got to find a word so that you draw the people in and so that they see it for themselves.
Yeah.
And I mean, the advertising or people in advertising and education can do that, but it's not there.
No.
Listen to I listen to the news, I watch television news, and there's a lot of what I call trivia, which could be something interesting. Something interesting to people that don't know. My neighbour, for example, and I don't like the word ignorant, I prefer the word unaware. And so that's what I think is raising the awareness of just what's going on.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. I mean, again, I haven't been through the education system. I think there's an awful lot that should be included, could easily be included, but just isn't mentioned. And I think, again, looking at the news or the politicians, they often don't know. My biggest bugbear is when you do go to these big events with politicians. We talked about it before we started filming. Is you go to an event to talk about a topic, politician comes up, says, "Hello, experts. Lovely to have you all here. It's fantastic that we're going to solve this problem today. See ya," and then they leave. And then all the experts are left there to talk to each other who already know what we need to do. And actually the only person that needed talking to is left. And that happens every single time. So, it's incredibly frustrating. But again, there just needs to be better sort of engagement. Invite a couple of experts for tea, or something like that. Politicians, there's an idea for you. So, it's very frustrating. So, okay, good one there. So lastly then, what do you think could be the biggest change or idea or solution or anything like that to sort of implement the change to have more trees in our landscape? I'd be interested in your thoughts. More open grown trees. What do you think we could do to lead to more of that? Now I have an idea, but I'll be interested to hear any thoughts you have. And
well, I've written about it, and I call it now. Well, you've got to separate the trees into two. One, we definitely need foresters. We definitely need plantations. So if we step outside that and see all the people that think they're doing good planting trees and getting a grant, and so they plant a plantation, okay, where in actual fact, because they are not foresters, where possible, we should be planting open grown trees. So my thrust would be trying to get society, outside foresters, society to plant open grown trees, and instead of saying, "Oh, we planted 100 trees today, aren't we great?" which they are, but we planted 10 trees and they're open grown, because the 10 trees that are open grown, from the point of view of wildlife value, amenity value, and above all, carbon capture, it's the open grown tree. And so somehow or other, we've got to get them to see that an open grown tree can be anything up to 50 times more important than what the same tree planted in a woodland. And so the latest one I've come up with is that an open grown tree, for all its life, especially when it's got leaves on it, is a solar panel. It's a huge 360-degree solar panel. So that's capturing capturing energy free. And it's designed by nature, and you can't beat nature. Then including that, if it's in what I call permanent pasture, then permanent pasture eventually will equal it in carbon capture. It makes sense. So somehow we've got to get the grant system in the Forestry Commission so that an open-grown tree they get the grant for an open-grown tree in the same way. And as somebody said to me, when you planting a tree is the most important thing in that tree's life. And what are we doing for the future if we're not planting these open-grown trees? At the moment, that one out there is incredibly important for, and it's a Norway Norway maple, and it's brilliant. And that's been 6 months, 7 months, 8 months capturing carbon. Beat it. And I look at it even now in the winter and I see this lovely tree. Apart from shouting at you, it calms me down.
That's good. Yeah, I think it's interesting to sort of try and understand how to encourage implementing like the solutions is a real big challenge. So I've just last night came back from COP. So I've been talking to a lot of political people and all sorts over the last few days. I wasn't there for the podcast. I was there for some other things I'm involved with. But for me, there has to be some sort of better sort of policy strategy to actually make things happen. So you said about the funding mechanism, and I completely agree. But I think for me, it's understanding how we can get some sort of like policy to encourage that. And the only way I can think to do it is canopy cover, having a guide for sort of canopy cover. Because if you had something like that, it doesn't matter where you're sticking the tree. So if you're putting one tree in the middle of a field, that canopy is going to be a heck of a lot, as you say, bigger than 10 trees all planted straight together, or a block of woodland. And it also opens it up for farmers or whoever else it is to put that tree in the urban environment or in the landscape or whatever. So it gives a bit more sort of flexibility. And you can have guidance alongside that of how to do it, of course, not just a blanket thing. But I was thinking something like that may be worth looking at, because we do it in London, but a lot of Europe calculate it differently. But in London, they have canopy cover objectives in some areas. And I don't see why at the moment we only have woodland creation objectives. It just seems backwards, because when I used to manage a farm, and we wanted to plant loads of little copses of trees and stuff, no support, so we didn't do anything, so because they couldn't afford to do anything. So whereas if that policy was there, you could have done something really meaningful and got maybe 50 trees across the farm, whereas if it was woodland, you'd have none.
Well, our problem, of course, is the biggest voice we got is the Woodland Trust, and because of the administrative side of it, that the people that go out and get the money, he's a block. Well, I know I'm telling you the pure story now. He's just wants to get money, and to him, money is planting lots of trees, and he is stopping the money that's coming in, or at least educating the public to a point where they want their money spent on isolated trees. I know him. I know him very well. And so that's just one man and his team, because they see numbers as the way to get the money. We planted 1 million trees, but if we came back from that and said we planted 6,000 open-grown trees or something, because they're much more valuable to society. But it's getting over that.
Well,
So we are hopefully meeting the top dog again.
Well, invite me next time as well. And because the thing is as well, it's also got to be monitorable, right? But that's why I think canopy covers. But I'm doing a lot on policy at the moment. People might guess, but it's actually, you can actually monitor it. We already do it. We already assess the canopy cover of regions of the UK. So you're already doing that survey regularly. So you can check it against something. Whereas numbers mean nothing.
You go away. You go
Thanks,
away and give me the canopy cover of an open-grown tree versus one in a wood. I never worked it out. Jill's had a couple of goes. Said we've got it here somewhere, but that needs putting out there. That one tree equals 15 or 20 other trees in a plantation. There's your exercise for tonight.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for having us.
Oh, come on.
And thank you for talking about the book and giving me a chance to read it and everything you've bloody done, Ted. Because
I got you in one the day I met you, so don't worry. I mean, I dealt with students and scientists all my life, and you get an inert instinct for the people that you want to spend time with and work with, rather than waste time, because there's a lot of shit out there. And so I got you in one, don't worry.
And thank you for your time helping me do what I'm doing, because it's only because of people like you and the time you give me that's made it possible. So
but you want to say thanks. Buy that book and I'll put in it now to the future.
Cheers. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Ted. Thanks for your time as always. And look forward to seeing you when the next one comes out.
Well, yeah. But let's get this one off the ground first. I'm getting
buy the book.
get concerned that it's not sold many at the moment.
There's another call to action for everybody listening there. Brilliant. Thank you so much.
See you
again soon.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but this episode is sponsored by Water Offsets. If you are working on projects where you might need environmental credits, then they are the people to go to. They specialise in not only biodiversity net gain credits, but also water neutrality and nutrient neutrality too. So if you have an estate, a farm, or some other kind of landowner, or interested in that kind of project, then they could really help you find new ways of funding those projects and diversifying your land and farms, to take you through the whole process. And if you're a developer who's run into problems, then actually they can help provide those credits that you need to unlock your land and get your development done. So check out Water Offsets if you need help with any of those things. Many thanks. Hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you're interested in hearing more from Ted, then why not check out our previous episode with him and the incredible Jill Butler, where we talk about some of the amazing rewilding projects that they've been involved with across the UK, how the UK landscape used to be, and much more. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to friends and colleagues who might be interested. And a huge thank you to our incredible sponsors, Water Offsets and Vectorworks, our kind supporters, Gillian Goodson Design and the Birmingham Botanical Gardens, and of course, NDLA and Monster Don for powering this episode.